The scene unfolds in the bocage country of Normandy. Shortly after the invasion, in the summer of 1944, a German Panther commander, seasoned by years of combat, stands exposed in his cupola, scanning the horizon through high-powered field glasses. Ahead lies open ground, a stretch of perhaps 3,000 meters extending to the next distinct To his experienced eye, the sector appears secure. There are no telltale muzzle flashes betraying anti-tank positions, no rhythmic thumping of artillery, and no movement of infantry. Confident in the silence, he signals his driver to advance. The tracks of the heavy tank churning the earth as they move into the open. 30 seconds later, the calm is shattered not by the boom of a cannon, but by a sudden, hissing rain of lead. Bullets begin striking the ground and the armor at steep, plunging angles, dropping from the sky like metal hail. Infantrymen advancing alongside the armor, caught in the open without immediate cover, are instantly pinned down or incapacitated. The commander, realizing the peril of this unnatural storm, buttons up his hatch, retreating into the steel belly of his machine. His vision is immediately reduced to the narrow, claustrophobic view of periscopes, and the advance that began with confidence slows to a hesitant crawl. He never spots the weapon harassing him, nor does he see a muzzle flash. The source of this devastating fire is located 2 miles away, positioned behind British lines, crewed by men who cannot see the tank any more than the commander can see them. This was the terrifying capability of the Vickers .303 medium machine gun, a weapon employed by the British Army in a manner that no other military force in the Second World War fully understood or utilized. While every major combatant nation in the conflict fielded machine guns, the philosophy behind their use varied wildly. Defining the tactical doctrines of their respective armies, the Germans boasted the MG-42, a marvel of stamped steel engineering with a rate of fire so rapid it sounded like tearing canvas. Designed to suppress the enemy through sheer volume and psychological terror, the Americans relied on the Browning series, robust and reliable weapons that emphasized mobility and direct support. However, neither the Wehrmacht nor the U.S. Army routinely employed machine guns at a battalion scale with the mathematical precision of artillery planning. It was the British alone who developed the necessary higher mathematics, the rigorous training regimens, and the specialized doctrine required to drop sustained automatic fire onto targets as far as 4,500 yards away. These were targets that the gunners themselves could not see. Engaged using principles borrowed from howitzer crews rather than riflemen, the tactical problem this solved was fundamental to modern warfare. Infantry advancing across open ground were liable to be slaughtered, and tanks with open hatches were vulnerable to small arms. Commanders needed to see the battlefield, yet exposing themselves to use binoculars invited death. Direct-fire machine guns could suppress an enemy position, but the moment they opened fire, they revealed their location to return fire. Mortar strikes, or flanking maneuvers. The British solution was to create a system where fire arrived without warning, where bullets fell from an empty sky onto positions that seemed safe from observation, teaching the enemy that even miles from the front, they were never truly safe. To achieve this, the British relied on the Vickers gun, a weapon that, by 1939, appeared hopelessly unfashionable and obsolete to modern observers. In an era where military trends favored air cooling and lightweight mobility, the Vickers was a water-cooled, belt-fed heavy beast. The gun itself weighed 30 pounds when empty, rising to 40 pounds once the water jacket was filled. When the essential tripod and ammunition were added, a Vickers team was lugging over 90 pounds of equipment before a single round could be fired. German tacticians, obsessed with the blitzkrieg doctrine of speed and maneuver, looked at the Vickers and saw a relic of the First World War, a piece of yesterday's technology that had no place in mobile warfare. They were profoundly wrong. The Vickers fired the standard British .303 cartridge at a cyclic rate of between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 2,440 feet per second. On paper, these specifications matched or even fell below the German and American equivalents. However, the true difference lay in what happened after the first minute of firing. Air-cooled guns, like the German MG-42 or the American M1919, were inherently limited by thermodynamics. They overheated rapidly. Under sustained fire, an MG-42 crew had to change barrels frequently, often after just a few hundred rounds of rapid bursts. To prevent the rifling from being stripped out or the metal from warping, crews carried spare barrels and asbestos gloves for these quick swaps. But those seconds of downtime created windows of vulnerability and broke the continuity of fire. The Vickers, conversely, was an engine of endurance. Its water jacket held roughly 7 to 12 imperial pints of water, which would begin to boil after approximately 600 rounds of continuous fire. While boiling water would typically be a problem, the Vickers was designed with a steam condensing system. A flexible hose captured the escaping steam and fed it into a condensing can, reclaiming the water and allowing it to be poured back into the jacket. This closed-loop cooling system meant that as long as the crew managed to heat, kept the water topped up, and changed the barrel hourly at a leisurely pace compared to the frenetic barrel swaps of the MG-42, the gun could run almost indefinitely. With an adequate supply of ammunition and water, a single Vickers gun could sustain a rate of 10,000 rounds per hour. This was not suppression for mere minutes. This was suppression for hours, extending through entire battles. Post-war endurance trials famously pushed Vickers guns into the millions of rounds with minimal loss of function, a feat of mechanical reliability that no air-cooled weapon of the era could hope to match. This unshakable reliability was the cornerstone that enabled the British Army to attempt something no other army did at scale: indirect fire, because the gun could be relied upon to fire uninterrupted for extended periods. British doctrine treated the machine gun platoon not as infantry support, but as precision artillery batteries. The key to this was the Mark V tripod, a heavy, stable platform that incorporated a dial sight similar to those used on mortar or field guns. This sight allowed crews to calculate elevation and traverse without ever having a visual line of sight to the target. The gunners were equipped with elaborate range tables, published in 50-yard increments, which provided tangent angles, wind corrections, time of flight, and the dimensions of the beaten zone out to a staggering 4,500 yards. When firing the later Mark VIII boat-tailed ammunition, which had better aerodynamic properties, gunners were required to learn trajectory mathematics. They calculated adjustments for barometric pressure, air temperature, and the angle of sight relative to the horizon. They utilized small, repeatable tap corrections on the traversing gear to walk bursts across a target area mathematically. They were not aiming at individual men. They were aiming at grid squares on a map. The concept of the beaten zone was central to this method of warfare. The beaten zone is the elliptical pattern where a burst of bullets strikes the ground, and its shape changes drastically with range. Close-range fire produces a narrow, elongated pattern because the bullets are traveling on flat trajectories. However, as the range increases, the angle of descent becomes steeper. Medium-range fire creates shorter, wider patterns, and beyond 2,000 yards, the pattern lengthens again as minute variations in muzzle velocity and atmospheric drag spread the rounds across a larger area. Effective indirect fire required a minimum of 4 guns firing in unison, with their beaten zones overlapping to ensure a continuous curtain of lead over the target area. This allowed the British to deny entire sectors of the battlefield to the enemy, making movement impossible across key crossroads, valleys, or supply routes, all without the enemy ever seeing a gunner. The organizational structure of the British Army reflected this unique capability. While other nations distributed their heavy machine guns to infantry companies, the British consolidated them into dedicated machine gun battalions at the divisional level. Famous regiments such as the Middlesex Regiment, the Manchester Regiment, the Cheshire Regiment, and the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers converted entire battalions to this specialized role between 1936 and 1937. Each battalion fielded between 36 and 48 Vickers guns, organized into companies of 12, often supplemented with attached heavy mortar. In the late war period, this centralization meant that machine gun fire was planned at the brigade or divisional level, coordinated intimately with artillery programs. Rather than being used for reactive suppression firing only when the enemy appeared, the guns traveled in universal carriers, giving them the mobility to reach firing positions quickly, where they would set up to deliver sustained indirect barrages that could last for hours. Historical records from the Imperial War Museum confirm that Vickers teams operated in this capacity in every major British campaign of the war. At Tobruk in November 1941, the King's Own Regiment utilized these tactics in the defense of the perimeter. During the Italian campaign, the 2nd New Zealand Division at Monte Cassino used rangefinders to direct indirect fire against German paratroopers entrenched in the Monastery Heights, suppressing positions that direct fire could not reach due to the rugged terrain. During the Normandy campaign, the 2nd Cheshire Regiment supported the 50th Division at Oelbag in June 1944, breaking up German counterattacks before they could form. Later, during the Rhine crossing in March 1945, the 1st Commando Brigade utilized these barrages to cover their amphibious assault. By 1945, British forces had refined these combined arms tactics to a devastating art form. Operation Veritable, the push to the Rhine in February 1945, employed what planners called the pepper pot method. This involved coordinating machine gun battalions with 4.2-inch mortars, anti-aircraft guns used in ground rolls, tanks, and conventional artillery into a single, integrated fire plan. In one instance, 850 pepper pot barrels fired alongside 1,050 artillery pieces. In this symphony of destruction, the Vickers provided the sustained intermediate fire, filling the gap between the heavy crump of mortar shells and the high-explosive artillery rounds with continuous streams of plunging bullets, effectively denying movement across entire sectors of the German front. The most detailed account of the weapon's effectiveness comes from the diaries of Rex King, an officer in the 2nd Battalion Manchester Regiment in Burma, serving as the divisional machine gun battalion for the British 2nd Division. During the critical battles of Kohima and Impol in 1944, Clark was ordered to compile accounts of the Vickers' effectiveness directly from the infantry regiments they supported. This created primary source material detailing how the weapon performed against Japanese positions. the results were grimly effective. Similarly, at outpost snipe during the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, Vickers guns of the 2nd Battalion Rifle Brigade engaged German tank crews fleeing from vehicles destroyed by anti-tank guns. Regimental accounts describe the guns cutting down the tankers as they ran desperately for safety across open ground. While the men operating the guns at snipe could see their targets, the doctrine proved that the same weapons, positioned further back and firing on calculated bearings, could have achieved similar results against crews who believed themselves safe behind cover. In contrast, German doctrine never developed an equivalent capability. Despite possessing the theoretical means to do so, the MG-34 and MG-42 could be mounted on the Lafette 42 tripod, which was equipped with the MGZ-34 40th telescopic sight, theoretically allowing for fire out to 3,500 meters. The mount even featured a unique Tiefenführertat mechanism, which automated the sweeping of the beaten zone by mechanically raising and lowering the gun during firing. However, the German military philosophy was fundamentally different. Their doctrine focused on direct fire support to aid maneuver, not planned, sustained indirect barrages. They viewed the machine gun as a squad weapon to be pushed forward, not as divisional artillery to be held back. Every German infantry squad carried an MG, giving their units significantly higher automatic firepower at close quarters compared to British squads, but leaving them with no capability for the sustained, long-range area denial that British doctrine demanded. The Americans sat somewhere in the middle but ultimately favored a different approach. The American M1917, water-cooled Browning, was a machine gun that offered sustained fire performance comparable to the Vickers. In testing, a single M1917 was recorded firing 21,000 rounds in a 48-minute continuous burst, a testament to its rugged design. American heavy weapons companies did practice indirect fire techniques, but as the war progressed, the lighter air-cooled M1919A4 became the standard. The M1919 lacked a quick-change barrel, meaning sustained rates of fire had to be kept conservative to avoid destroying the weapon. Consequently, American doctrine evolved toward maximizing volume of fire and mobility rather than sustained precision. While British battalions concentrated their Vickers guns for coordinated divisional shoots, American units tended to disperse their machine guns for direct support, sacrificing the artillery effect for immediate responsiveness at the platoon level. The legacy of the Vickers gun is one of extraordinary longevity. It remained in British frontline service until the Radfan campaign in Aden in the early 1960s, finally retiring in 1968 after more than half a century of continuous service, the longest operational life of any British Army weapon system. The Indian Army maintained Vickers guns well into the 1980s, and confirmed reports even placed Vickers guns in the Syrian civil war in the 21st century, more than 100 years after the design was adopted. However, one specific legend regarding the gun deserves clarification. A famous claim exists that 10 guns of the 100th Machine Gun Company fired 1 million rounds over 12 hours at High Wood on August 24, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme. While this makes for dramatic storytelling, peer-reviewed research by Dr. Rich Willis and Richard Fisher, published in First World War Studies in 2019, analyzed war diaries and technical capabilities to debunk this specific figure. The actual count was approximately 99,500 rounds fired from 6 guns, while the million-round claim was a post-war embellishment, firing nearly 100,000 rounds in 12 hours, without mechanical failure, is still a remarkable feat of engineering and endurance that few other weapons in history could replicate. Ultimately, the story of the Vickers is not just about a piece of hardware. It is about the synthesis of technology and doctrine. The British developed a tactical system that turned a 50-year-old weapon into something unprecedented on the modern battlefield, while German engineers focused on designing the fastest-firing infantry weapon of the war, and Americans focused on production, volume, and mobility. The British doctrine transformed a slower, heavier, and more primitive design into a devastating form of divisional artillery. German tank commanders in Normandy learned to fear open ground not because they could see the threat, but because they could not. Somewhere beyond the horizon, behind hills that blocked their view, Vickers crews were consulting wind tables, checking barometric pressure, and calculating angles. The bullets would arrive without warning, plunging from the sky to strike surfaces that direct fire could never reach. That was the triumph of British engineering, not merely building a superior gun, but developing a superior way to use it, creating a system that their enemies never fully learned to counter.